Hello, everybody. Welcome into another episode of the Fantasy Football Podcast. I'm Shane Peterson. With me, we've got Greg Bright and Allan Culp, and we're trying to do this episode on video. So hopefully, this will be on YouTube for you to enjoy. If you're listening, you can hop on over and see our beautiful faces. I think that's going to be a real treat for you. We all look, this beautiful smile from Allan. We're in great shape tonight. We're doing great things. This is a pretty exciting show. This is one actually that Greg and I have been talking about for a long time. Is sort of a general draft strategy show, something that's sort of timeless to some degree. How do you approach your draft every single year? What things should you be taking in? How should you be starting to approach it and think? And really, what are some of the methods that we employ to feel prepared for a draft, and then even during the draft, how do we go about handling our business to usually come out feeling good about our picks? Doesn't always happen, but preparation is definitely key, and we're going to kind of run through some ideas tonight to help you get ready for your upcoming draft. And this is always going to be here. So if you forget some of these pointers next season or 10 seasons from now, because we're in this for the long haul, right, gentlemen?
That's right.
You can come back to this and run it through and remember some of these brilliant ideas. I'm sure that you will all enjoy. But gentlemen, welcome.
Hey,
thanks for having me as always.
Nice to be here.
Well, let's jump right in, and Allan, I'm going to have you lead us off with talking about tracking off-season changes and how you kind of approach that and what it means for you when you're thinking about drafting.
Yeah, one of the things that I do, and I mean, this is probably kind of one of the biggest, hey, yeah, you obviously have to do this. Taking a look at the things that have gone on free agents for me is one of the biggest things to look at. Where have guys gone? How's it going to impact the new teams that they're on? How's it going to hurt the teams that they left? Who's going to step up and fill those voids? And there's obviously a lot of different places that you can pull data from and get insight from, because we get other input too. But you definitely got to know if the people that you're reading or the people that you're watching and that you're listening to have reliable opinions and that they're executing. So taking a look at that is huge. That's the biggest thing that I do. I digest and then take everything that I can on that. What about you guys?
Yeah, one big thing is, well, thinking about, so one of the things that's big is obviously rookies that come into the league, because every year there's a handful of high impact rookies that make a difference. It's pretty tough to guess who they're going to be year to year. But sort of to your point, you talked about, free agents, where people are coming and going. Really, the deal is, and you don't have to be a big college football person and know all about these players that are coming in. If you're a big NFL fan, you probably watched the draft, and maybe that's enough information on the background of these players. But I mean, it's safe to assume they're all very talented that are coming in, but are they going to have the opportunity? That's the big question: is what are they stepping into? Is there real need on these teams? Or each year you hear about a really high potential individual and everyone's real excited about a wide receiver who's got, 4.3 speed, but they're buried fourth or fifth on the depth chart. That's not someone you need to get too excited about. But in years where you have, last year it was Clyde Edwards-Helaire coming into the Kansas City Chiefs with a clear path to tote. I mean, they were excited about him, and there was really nobody in front of him. And ended up having a nice year. I think some of us got a little too excited, myself included.
Well, that's
but
Najee Harris
each year, those are, yeah, that's exactly, and that's the kind of thing you're looking for. Is there a possibility for this guy to come in and carry the ball 300 times? Because there is no challenge to carries.
Yeah, and that's talking about the rookies from last year, like Jonathan Taylor, he totally upstaged CEH, and we weren't looking at him in the first round. So we talk a lot about value on here. So CEH was a disappointment for a lot of people, expected him in round one, but you never know what you're going to get.
Yeah, and one more thing that you can actually quantify and look at from a number standpoint, and so much of what we do in fantasy football is educated guesswork, right? So you can bring in the data and think about what you think is most likely to happen. And in this case, there are teams where you've had a whole lot of targets depart. Guys have left in free agency, and so this were guys that counted for 200-300 targets on an offense. That we're looking at any time you have a big free agent signed somewhere else, you have to know that there's a vacuum. And so, who's left on that team or who else has come into that team and could soak up some of those targets? Who's likely to be the next guy up? Who's got a reliable rapport with the quarterback? It's reasonable to expect that that person's going to take a step forward from a fantasy standpoint because opportunity is key. And the same thing goes for running backs. You see a free agent running back signed somewhere with a running back you already liked, there's likely to be a hit. It may not be massive, but that can take somebody from RB1 potential to sort of a clear cut RB2. And then there's also the challenge of overreaction. So that's where you have to really develop your own opinion. But knowing some of these things makes a big difference. If you get to draft night and you're cruising through and you make a pick that you're real excited about, and then you get worn out in the chat because didn't you know this other guy had come in and this was going to be a tough year for him. You don't really want to be in that position. That's a tough spot.
My overreaction candidate this year is James Robinson. That's who I'm targeting heavy in my drafts because I think there's an overreaction right now to is Travis Etienne going to really take a huge workload here? So, yeah, understanding that type of thing and then forming an opinion on it will help you potentially tap into some of that value that might slip down the draft.
Well, and that's an area too where you talk about a guy that if you watch a lot of college football, Etienne is incredibly talented. He's fantastic. I can't wait to see him playing football on Sundays. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he supplants a guy who was also high quality last year, has been in the league for another year or a full year now. I mean, it is still a tough transition year to year. I mean, rookie quarterbacks, we see this traditionally. There's not great positive outcomes. Rookie tight ends usually don't have big first years. So you can also fall into that trap where everyone's talking about how fast somebody looks and how amazing they are, but they have to learn the blocking schemes and the protections and just all kinds of incredible stuff that goes on behind the scenes that none of us are privy to. That makes it really hard for them to get a lot of playing time early on, and maybe by the end of the season, some of these guys are rocking and rolling. But you can't really punt the first half of your season with high draft picks. So that it all plays a role, and the other piece to this, I think, is looking. Well, one of the other big areas is to think about is understanding how the depth of positions in your draft look for an upcoming season. Greg, you want to take us there?
Yeah, and this really goes back to what we have hammered home a million times over the course of this show is the draft is all about value, right? So that's it, right? And so if the QB position, for example, is really deep, then find your value at that position later in the draft and focus your higher draft picks on skill players at thinner positions, right? And so, yes, understanding where there is depth at a certain position is essential to having a successful draft. Excuse me. So, tight end is the other one that we talk about a lot, right? So, tight end is super thin. I don't even believe that tight end should be a position in fantasy football, but that's a separate spicy take, right? But so knowing like, and that's why I'm looking at Travis Kelsey if I'm in the middle of the first this year. Actually, did you know it's Kels, by the way? Apparently, he came out and said that it's actually pronounced Kels, but everyone just says Kelsey, so he's just going with it. Anyways, side topic.
Good
But
for him. I love when
Interesting.
you just come to peer pressure. Like he's not going to stand his ground on his own last
yes,
name.
so
That's
I don't
awesome.
know what I'm going to call him anymore. But that's why I'm looking at him if I'm in the middle to the end of the first round because there is no one at tight end. And so if I can secure that guy at that position where there's so much uncertainty, then yes, I'm going to go for it. So, and that's why we talked about in our mock draft episode. Go back and check that out, by the way. That like Pat Mahomes is not a bad pick because he's likely to be the QB1. But the difference between the QB1 position and QB12, if it's only 75 points over the course of a season, that's not worth taking him that early, right? And so yes, understanding where there is depth is really important.
Yeah, and too, one of the other things, and I think we'll probably hit on this a little bit later, but a sort of understanding as you go through these drafts. I think probably episodes ago, right? We talked a lot about that sort of like that wide receiver two bunch that has happened the last several years in drafts. That's one area where not necessarily just mock drafting, but looking at lists of average draft positions are really interesting because you can kind of see how some of this is playing out and knowing where there's bulk and where there are. At this year, um, in 2021, we're going to have there's a desert basically for running backs. There is a
Yeah.
multiple round stretch where there are not running backs you really want to take that are at a value. And so, kind of seeing a little bit of that in advance helps a little bit for you to be prepared and make sure that you don't get to that spot and have to panic and freak out. Again, kind of coming back to looking at the depth piece a little bit, and this year especially, the wide receiver depth is ludicrous. So just keep taking them though; they're all amazing.
And that's an important point too, right? Is to not panic. So like if you're focusing too much on, all right, I've got two running backs, I have to get a wide receiver now. Well, no, you don't. If you're at a position where there isn't a wide receiver that's a great value at that pick, well, who is the best value at that time then? So don't force yourself into filling out your roster just because I mean, obviously you need to fill all of your starting positions, but if you've got a flex position, that gives you a little bit of, you know, flexibility to draft accordingly, right?
Yeah, basically, don't behave like an auto draft bot. Don't just fill in the next slot just to do it. That's very good advice.
Yeah, and you can't
Well,
just
the
use
one that
you can't just use
go ahead.
the expert rankings or the ADPs because you have to know whatever your opinion is. So if you're not comfortable taking a guy, don't take a guy. If you like a guy, and I think this is kind of one of the things that we're going to talk about here in a little bit, is we hear a lot about sleepers, we hear a lot about busts, and you're going to have opinions on that. It kind of comes with that movement, and everybody has kind of some different takes on there. But later on in the draft, if you're willing to take some of these guys who have a higher ceiling somewhere else over somebody, um, you know, take that shot. But taking a look at those sleepers and those busts are good, and that comes with reading your stuff, like we've already talked about. Let other people dig in and do the dirty work for you.
Yeah, and if you read, this is every single year. I'll specifically call out. I get a phone call from my mom who likes to play fantasy football, and she calls me. She calls me about the first week of August, second week of August, and she says, "I haven't thought or listened to anything about football all year long. What do I do? I know we're going to draft it. I don't want to lose this year." And so I
I love
usually
Mama P.
That's right. I usually tell her to go to like three places and read three sleeper and bust articles. And the beauty of that is, that you can cherry pick your statistics that can prove your point. But if you look at just a few different sources, including us, right, we will have a very spicy sleeper and bust show for you to absorb and take in. But really, what you have to do, you have to walk away and after reading those, say, I buy into this one, and this one makes a ton of sense to me. Don't take them all at your word, and don't just start highlighting all these names because somebody told you they were going to be a sleeper, or crossing off names because someone told you they're going to be a bust. Does the logic work for you? That's what I'm always doing is just trying to figure out, what this person is saying makes a ton of sense, and because I know these other things, I can believe this, and this is very logical. So that's I think the big takeaway that you can get from some of this preseason chatter. I would go to reputable sources, and like we've joked about, maybe not so much the beat writers who get paid to sensationalize six string wide receivers, but the professionals that are out there, they're trying to do a good job. They're like we're trying to do right by you all, and do the work so you don't have to. But check it out and develop your opinion based off of that. Greg, I can't wait to hear you talk about mock drafting. I know this is something that is a love hate for you.
Well, yeah, I mean, and I'm just going to repeat what I've already said in past episodes, in that, like, you have to be really careful about putting too much emphasis on, okay, I did 20 mock drafts, I feel good about this, and that's all I need to do to be prepared for your real draft. So they're just not realistic at all. Um, you're drafting. I mean, typically like a third of the room is like live people, but usually after the first couple rounds, they stop paying attention or fall out altogether, and so you're just in a simulation with, you know, auto draft bots who are picking things according to whatever site you're on. Their pre-listed rankings there, and so it's not realistic at all. And so you just can't do that and hope that that's going to be enough. Now there are things to learn from mock drafts. If you are lucky enough to get in a room with 12 actual human beings, you can get a sense for who's trending, who people are hot on, who people are
Mm.
who might be falling a little bit. But again, that room's going to fall apart in a couple rounds typically. Most people aren't devoting an hour to going through a mock draft online. Sometimes I do, but um, it's just you can't put too much emphasis on it. Now, if you can do, I hate to, like, I always plug their website, but so they owe us money, but Fantasy Pros has a simulator where
Not a sponsor.
we can. No, I should tag them on Twitter. By the way, follow us on Twitter, FFB Podcast. Um, and by the way, we'd like to know if you're out there, if like we have listeners, so feel free to tag us or comment on some of our posts. Again, FFB podcast. But and now I've lost my train of thought completely. So Fantasy
You were going
Pros
to tell
has
us about the
Mock,
fantasy pros,
mock
yeah.
drafts, yeah,
yeah,
fantasy
they
pros.
have a simulator where like you don't have to wait. It's doing kind of a consensus ADP type of thing where it is a bot that you're going against, but it's almost instantaneous. So you're not wasting 35 45 minutes going through a fake draft. It blasts right through it. So there are some good tools out there, and if you want to spend money, there are tools that can like draft assistance. Various sites have those where it'll plug into your browser, and if you're on Yahoo, for example, it'll say, oh, this guy's way lower than he should be, here's a value pick type of thing. But I've never done that. Have any of you ever paid for something like that? Yeah, I
Uh,
haven't either. I'd like
No,
to, but I don't
I,
have.
I, I'm too cheap, and I keep finding the promised land. So until something corrects me, I probably won't.
Yeah, I mean,
and
I
But
haven't
you know,
I haven't done it either. But if you want to spend money on it, go for it. It'll save you some time listening to our podcast probably.
whoa,
But we don't want you to do that.
but it won't be nearly as much fun.
that's right.
Uh, Shane, are you a big mock drafter or no?
You know what? I like to do it. So the big thing for me is once I'm able to find out, and you should be able to, as soon as your leagues are full, you should be able to get your draft spot. That's a big thing. Get your draft slot as early as you can in your league, so you can start fretting it and worrying about it quickly. That's I always draft at the end of my end of the first round. I like it's just I have bad luck that way. I do like to do mock drafts because the first, really just for like the first 3 or 4 rounds. I like to see how they break out and like who's grabbing somebody. I mean, if you even have, quite frankly, for a lot of our leagues, if you've got a work league or if you've got one that's with casual acquaintances, you probably end up with a third of your actual draft auto drafting or drafting without a ton of knowledge anyway. So those first few rounds, if you can have a half full room, it gives you kind of an indication. What does the turn look like, and who's kind of which 3 or 4 guys are around there usually when I'm making my second and maybe my third pick. But to your point, Greg, after that, I mean, I feel bad, but after that, I'm out because the rest of the room is out. So that's really all I'm looking for, is so that I feel, with a little bit of repetition, I feel like I kind of have an idea of what 4 or 5 options I want with my first 2 picks or something like that.
So Yahoo has trophies. You guys have played on Yahoo.
Mhm.
You get those trophies for, hey, you completed a mock draft or you completed 10 mock drafts. There's a trophy for 50, I think. And so I always try to get the most trophies in my league because if I lose, I'll still feel like I had something. So one year, I think it might have been last year, then I did 50 of them, just so I could get that stupid trophy. And what I will tell you, like just as a word of caution, is like it creates like a false sense of hope after you do that many mock drafts to say like, oh, I consistently got this guy in the third round. And then in your real draft, that plan falls apart and he's gone. And then your whole like, oh, now I don't know what to do because I've kind of been planning on getting this type of guy or, at this certain place. And so it's psychologically, it can be traumatizing, I think. So,
Well, here, I think that's a really good segue to knowing. We'll jump to knowing your competition, because I think that's something that you can think about if you're assessing your picks. If you're trying to kind of create a little bit of a blueprint about how you might want to attack your draft, and you can really only do this for the early rounds with just your draft position, right? Because it's, yeah, you get later to a draft and there's no telling what's on the board or who's there, what
Mhm.
need looks like. You kind of have to let that part come to you for the most part. But the big thing that you can do, especially if you know your fellow uh, managers well, is think about what's probably going to happen, right? We have favorite teams, we have biases. What are yours? Who do you love? Who are you not going to draft? Are you going to pass on all the Steelers so that I know that if Greg's picking after me, that Najee Harris is still going to be on the board? Um, you know, you can these things are real, and every single year Greg's got to go grab Chris Carson if he's less than 15 spots away from his draft
he's
slot.
balling this year too.
And years ago, our buddy Justin was just an unapologetic Gronkowski fan, and so Rob Gronkowski was he made Rob Gronkowski Travis Kelsey before Travis Kelsey was getting
Mhm.
drafted in the first round. So those are the kinds of things that you can know about your league to some extent, and you can kind of predict a bit, especially when you're in the draft, thinking about what you think guys in front of you are going to do, because you hopefully you know them well enough to be able to see that, and then also make sure you know your biases. What do you care at all that they're there? Do you want to check them? Do you want to overcome them? Are they hindering you? If they're not, then just rock and roll and enjoy
Mhm.
yourself.
Yeah, and coming on the heels of that mock draft conversation that we were having, like when you're in those mock drafts, you know that people are going to be leaving early, like Shane, or there's going to be a lot of bots and things like that. But even when you're in your real draft, having that opinion. So I recently did a mock draft. Well, I was watching the Cubs game, right, and I knew when my pick was coming up, and I knew the guys that I wanted to target, and it was interesting to watch where they went, um, regardless of where they were. So some of the guys that I have my eye on, because we all have our lists, right? And the guys that we're willing to pay for and make a jump for, and the guys that we're like, no, but then if we see them moving, so going through that, that's kind of something I wanted to toss out there. But knowing who's going to pick what, my buddy picked J.J. Watt. We had a defensive player specific position. He picked J.J. Watt in the first round one year, and he always did a quarterback wide receiver combo. So Drew Brees and Michael Thomas. So knowing those things is important.
Yeah, and to your point, if you have auto drafts, you can set this up. If there's auto drafters in your real draft, I've done. I mean, this is kind of in the weeds a little bit, but if there's a couple of auto drafts between, if you're like you're drafting 10th, and there's 4 spots between you and your next pick, between your 2 picks, and they're all going to be auto draft. If you're trying to figure out who you want to take here, there's a possibility that you can kind of do the guesswork to figure out what the bot is going to take for these guys. Because it's all based off of your platform rankings. That's how the system works. Not necessarily how we all work, but that's how the system works, and they'll start grabbing those guys off the top of the list if they're filling needs on their roster. So there's a game within the game, based off of the people that are around you and the computers that are drafting for people. um, but I think one of the other things that I'll kind of jump to, that I do, that kind of takes you away from reliance on. Oh wait, Greg, would you like to interject something, my friend?
Sorry, I tried the raising hand tool. No, well, before you moved on, I was just going to add really quickly that that's why I always advocate for in-person drafts too. It's kind of like playing in-person poker versus online poker. You can see the people sweating around you or panicking. and you get to know people better too. Like my main league, we always do an in-person draft, and like you pick up on those people they're in love with, or whatever it is those trends might be, better when you're meeting these people in person and doing it that way. So I'm always a big advocate of that, just FYI.
I'm with you. I think my main league is across 7 states and 3 time zones, so we
Haven't we
may
talked
all have
about
to just meet
Vegas?
up in New Orleans or something. Yeah, I don't know.
Clock's
Vegas
ticking,
is
buddy.
nice.
We got to get this planned out. Let's
I
go.
I think they've got full-fledged packages for that. That's like this is a thing. There's a whole industry around
They did
planning
that
these
in the
parties.
league,
So
didn't they? On the league, they went to Vegas for one of
Yeah,
theirs.
oh, I'm
they did.
sure.
Yeah.
I miss that show. Well, so the thing that I was going to mention that I always do, and again, I'm kind of neurotic, and this may or may not be of interest to you guys, but I will usually pull like most of my drafts are on Yahoo. It's just I've been using it since I was a young lad, and so I will pull Yahoo's average draft position list or their rankings list, whatever it is that I know that is going to be sitting in front of the people around me that are drafting, and I will know where I'm going to draft. There's a lot of there's websites that if you just punch in your draft position, you say I'm drafting ninth in a 12 team league, it'll tell you every single draft pick you're going to make, the 161st and so on and so forth. And I will actually just go through this list and look at where my draft picks will hit on this whole list. And just kind of look 5, 10 names around there and just do some of this highlighting, right? I've listened to I've read some sleeper articles and I've thought about my busts. And I know there's guys that I hate or guys that always get injured. And I'm crossing names off that are say, that they're around here. This is a do not draft for me, and I'm highlighting guys that if they're around here for this pick, I'm really interested in. And so I kind of use that cheat sheet as I follow along so that I don't get kind of out of my headspace when I'm looking at the computer doing my draft. That's the big thing for me is I don't want to lose my strategy and my approach by looking at Yahoo's list and panicking about the names that are flying off the board.
That's a really good idea. I like that because it's practical. You're looking at those ranges and you can kind of see things. And I've never thought of something like that. I just I know who I like. I know what I've heard, but having that and I have my guys picked out, kind of like Greg was talking about, of who I'm willing to take where. But seeing that range is really interesting. I like that idea. That's why you get paid the big bucks.
Yeah, in the
I don't know
past.
I don't know if it's effective, but it makes me feel better. That's half the battle for me is like, do I feel good going into my draft and do I feel in control throughout the draft?
Yeah, in the past, I've tried like creating my own custom list, and I didn't like it actually. What I learned was, if I'm ranking people a certain way, I'm losing some of that kind of perception of what's around you, like you said, Alan, and therefore I would end up taking someone who I was really into, but maybe a round or two before they would have
Mm.
gone. And so what I've learned that I like to do is use, like, so if I'm drafting in Yahoo, use Yahoo's draft rankings, what's going to show up, because everyone's going to be doing this from their computer or their phone. And so if you're familiar with Yahoo, for example, it's just going to give you the option of average draft picked or expert ranking. And so that's the only two ways that your competition can sort these things. And so I want to see what that list is. And then to Shane's point, highlight the guys that I think, okay, I can wait a little bit before I go for this guy because look at all the wide receivers above him still, or actually this guy's about to go. He's not going to make it to my next pick, so I do have to take him now, type of thing. So it's all relative. So I do like seeing what those rankings are according to the site that you're using, so you can keep an eye on. Exactly, because sometimes they're way off. ESPN and Yahoo might, have a guy that's 20 spots different. So it's important to understand that.
Yeah, I think that I mean that really is key to don't overthink the fact that people will still be just sitting in front of that same list. Whether or not you like that list, it's irrelevant. It's going to sit in front of them, and that's really how the draft is going to fall for the most part. You don't know. There's differentials, between pick to pick, and individual guys will fall, and some guys will get snatched up early. But it is going to kind of just move down that list. It always does, because there's usually only a few people in the room, in our rooms at least, that are crazy savvy and are only going to make the picks they want to make. Having that next name at the top of the list, it pushes people to make those picks.
Well,
And
especially
then
in
if
the
you have
earlier
anybody auto
rounds,
drafting, it's just grabbing them. Oh yeah,
because in those first 3 to 5 rounds, it's very close to their rankings list as far as who's going. I think if you were to chart it out, it's like towards the end of the draft is where you see the most separation between where a player is taken and where their average draft position is. But you're absolutely right.
that's where Yahoo usually crushes me in my draft review. Is that I like aggressively reach late in the draft. They think I'm overdrafting people by 50 spots, and I'm like, this was like my 13th pick. Not overdrafting anybody with my 13th pick.
Those grades are never accurate, so
No, no. If you're winning that, I wouldn't celebrate too early. That's winning your draft is not the same as winning your season. You can
Mhm.
probably lose your season in the draft, as Greg learned taking Le'Veon Bell over second overall a couple years ago when Le'Veon just decided not to play football.
I think that was an auto pick. I think that was an auto pick.
I didn't even think about that. Yeah, it must have been an auto
Especially
pick,
because he
right?
was a
Like
Stiller
you would
then.
never take that.
Oh
I
man.
joined that one
Yeah,
late. I joined that draft late. I remember it, and I was so mad that I
that's
got
it.
him. But anyways,
And you know what? That's a good time to bring up one of the things of have your list, your do not draft list, because whatever platform you're on, you can set up your lists ahead of time of do not draft and like draft. So for me, I used to be a big AFC West. I'm not playing any AFC West guys. I can't root against the Broncos. And so I would move LT over on the do not draft list or whoever it happened to be.
boy, that's tough.
But
One of the greatest
Yeah.
fantasy players ever, huh?
See,
that was
I'm
towards
all
the
in on.
end.
Give me all the Allen Robinson I can get. I'm not fading David Montgomery because I'm a Packers fan. That's I don't care if they can
I
help me
mean,
win. I'm all in
I
on it.
like your strategy, Alan. I mean, you're right. You want to. I've always said this. You want to have players that you like. That's why I won't have Najee Harris this year or any other Steelers. So I do like that.
Greggy is very likable. Just so we're clear.
Oh well.
So one thing that we skipped over that I don't think it needed to be fitting in anywhere else in particular. Really important. Know your league. Know how your league is set up when you're going into your
Right.
draft. Is it a PPR league? Is it a no tight end league like Greg wants? Is it a two quarterback league? Super flex? Are there big play bonuses? You know, chances are you're not going to rework your entire draft, but a lot of this turns into tiebreakers, right? Like you're like, I got a couple of guys I like. Well, is this guy getting a lot more targets and volume, and this guy's more touchdown dependent? So in a PPR league, you might be much more interested in drafting a certain wide receiver because of the volume they see. Same goes for running backs. Your running backs change up a little bit if it's a PPR draft.
Mm-hmm.
James
And
White.
so James White, right? The PPR god, your boy Travis Etienne is considered probably to be that guy this year. We'll see.
We'll see.
But, and so a savvy drafter will take all that into consideration and it will adjust your opinions. Again, I think if you were to take your own brain and draft a PPR draft and a non PPR draft, it wouldn't look night and day different. But you're going to make some changes. So make sure you understand your league before you go into it, and ask your commissioner if you don't know how to look at the settings, but check the settings.
One thing that slips under the radar sometimes, by the way, Cooper Cup, nice PPR boost too, is the
Mm-hmm.
QB touchdown points. I think the default for quarterback passing touchdowns is 4 points, but in my main league we do 6, which does change the projections a little bit. So yeah,
But
you really should look into those
it
settings.
pushes quarterbacks up your draft board a bit
It
too.
does.
That's for sure.
So you need to look not just at if it's PPR or not, or half PPR, but also some of those other things too. So including
Well, and I've been
sometimes
in.
people will have random special teams like receiving yards and stuff will count.
Mm-hmm.
And some leagues they don't. And so, you know, you got to look through that stuff.
Yeah, and I've been in leagues where 40-plus yard plays are worth an extra 2 points,
Right.
and there's only
Bonuses.
certain
Yeah.
guys that get those plays. I mean, that's
Yeah.
Yep.
again, I don't like a whole bunch of fancy scoring changes necessarily, but that's it's important to know.
Yeah, we've done individual defensive position players in the past, and when I look at those, I was in a league that they got kick return yards. So kick and punt return yards that pushes me towards the secondary, right? Like staying away from Aaron Donald, as great as he is, but going into a great kick return guy is going to get me more points than a whole bunch of sacks.
I love
Absolutely.
this IDP talk. I think we should get rid of kickers and defenses and have defensive players. I think it's fun.
In
It's been a very long time since I've done an IDP.
my second league, the one that I have to commission because Shane's not in it, we do a 2 quarterback and we do an IDP. So we've got some very interesting
I
things
love
that
it.
we rotate through.
I
So
like things that are different, you know? I like that.
Greg, next year, I promise you, next year we will set up a listener league, and it will be absolutely ludicrous. It can be Greg's listener league, and you can call all the shots. No
3
tight
quarterback,
ends, three
6 flex,
two
the
quarterback.
8-person
IDPs.
league.
That sounds terrible.
Yeah,
I'm
that's
in.
fun.
Let's gamble. Well, so Greg, you've got sort of a lightning round for us of sort of quick hits here that we wanted to discuss.
Yeah, so I don't think any of these deserve like a lot of time on this podcast, but some things that we haven't talked about yet, bye weeks. And so, and admittedly, I don't necessarily have the answer on some of these things, but rather I can just tell you anecdotally like what I've done, I guess, in the past. So I do pay attention to bye weeks. And so I think there's two strategies to go for. One, you don't pay attention to them at all. Or two, you try and get them all in 1 week. Now that's a bit of a stretch because I think you don't want to reach too far just for the sake of someone's bye week when there might be a better player that's available to take. So I think I think I've tried the bye week, like get them all aligned once or twice, and it never really pays off. It is nice if it happens by accident and you just know that you're going to give up that week, but the rest of your starters will be available for the rest of the season. But it's kind of hard to build your draft strategy completely around it. But I will say it's still nice to know, when you're looking at, drafting your starters where their bye weeks are. I don't know what your guys' thoughts are on that.
I do that
Yeah,
really heavily with my running backs because all my leagues are PPR. So I can't have all three of them gone. And my wide receivers, I pay a little bit less attention to that, but I'm cognizant of it.
yeah. It's mostly I use it mostly as a tiebreaker. You get later in your draft or middle of the draft, and you might have a couple of guys you like. I'm definitely looking and being cognizant of their bye weeks. I don't like to get in too much trouble because the stack, if you're going to do a proper stack, it's pretty tough to do. But if you go halfway, it's I don't know. It's sort of like it's really a poker move, right? You're either all in or you're all out at that point in time, and if you don't make it all the way, you're screwed.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
Allan raised a really good point that I wasn't even thinking about. It's like, well, if I've got 4 starters that I would absolutely not drop that all have the same bye week, that's not going to work because then I will have to drop some of my bench players or maybe the prized free agent that I picked up off the wire last week or whatever it is, just so I can get someone to fill in for this position. So it is important like you either go all the way or don't go at all on that, I guess.
Well, and this is something that I think we'll talk a little bit. We will have a show that's talking more about sort of trades and waiver wire activity to kind of give you some tips and tricks and some ideas. This is something that I'm always looking at during the season, right? I'm looking a couple of weeks ahead at once you start getting into bye weeks, and I start trying to make moves that make sense on my waivers if I have that flexibility in advance, right? Because people hit bye week. Sometimes there's bye week hell, and everybody's on bye week on all teams, and so they're just scrambling for the waiver wire. if you're pretty diligent about it and you pay attention, you don't let it surprise you. You can get ahead of it usually, but there's always that situation where the worst is when your kicker, your defense, and two of your starting position players are on bye, and so you either have to try. I usually end up trying to get by my week with like an out a kicker or defense or something because I have waiver wire stashes that I don't want to give up. So
Well,
Mm-hmm.
that's where
it's
those
tough.
yeah, and that's where those tricks come in too about utilizing your IR slots and everything like that, properly. So we'll get into those tricks in that episode. So I look forward to talking about that. But the next one in the lightning round, if you will, is handcuffs. And so again, this is one that I don't necessarily have the answer on. I can just tell you that I tend to like. I had Zeke last year, and I drafted Tony Pollard at the end of the draft. And then what happened was for most of the season, I was afraid to drop him, even though I knew he wasn't going to produce for me, because, well, that's my handcuff to Zeke. And that's really
Mm-hmm.
like in hindsight, I regret doing that, right? So I guess I think I've learned over the years is that handcuffs aren't as valuable as I think some fantasy experts will tell you they are. There are some handcuffs are more valuable than others, right? So Kareem Hunt is obviously different than Tony Pollard, but then again, Kareem Hunt is kind of drafted as a standalone fantasy player, anyways. Um, so I guess I would tell our listeners to not really focus as much on handcuffs unless you're getting him at the end of the draft or off the free agent wire, and B, if the guy that you're handcuffing is like really injury prone. So if I'm drafting Saquon Barkley, I might lean a little more heavily towards drafting his handcuff, whereas with other running backs, I might not.
Yeah, and I think if there's a little bit of standalone value, it's a lot easier to, Jamal Williams in Green Bay the last couple of years,
Latavius
they
Murray.
heavily utilize it, so he is a good handcuff. Yeah, but you could also use him in flex as a pin in a pinch or in a really good matchup. So I'm with you. I don't. I've never really done much with handcuffs. The only time I utilize a handcuff, again, we'll talk about this on our waiver show, is if I just have dead weight on the end of my bench, I'll go find a handcuff for the weekend and hang on to him. But I'm not prioritizing him in the draft. And to your point, there are analysts out there that are dead serious about if you have Zeke, you need to have Tony Pollard, and I don't buy it.
Yeah, I don't
Yeah,
either.
that makes three of us. We're unanimous on handcuffs. But if you show up to a draft late and get Le'Veon Bell the year he's sitting out, you probably want to get James Conner.
I didn't do that. Didn't do that. Yeah, well, what are you gonna
That would have been giving you two Stillers. That's why.
do? You're right. So the next one in our lightning round is one that it definitely took me a while to, I guess, to learn this lesson, I guess. And so that is to always look at the waiver wire as soon as your draft is over. Most draft settings, I might be wrong on this, but at least most of the drafts that I've been in, the people who went undrafted are usually free agents right away. Am I wrong on that, or I'm just lucky? I guess I don't know.
It should be set that way.
Yeah, they should
Sometimes
be
it's
set, but
not.
you'll probably
Sometimes there's
have
a
those
waiver file.
priorities already kicked in.
Right. So like if I made a real like we all have those regrets during the draft where you're like, why in God's name did I take this guy? And then you go to look at your waiver wire where everyone is still, you know, checking out their rosters and bragging to each other or having drinks or whatever it is after the draft is over. I'm looking at that waiver wire and I'm like, wait a minute, this guy's owned in 75% of leagues. Somehow he went undrafted, and I drafted this piece of crap in the 10th round. So I'm gonna fix this mistake right now. So it's a good way to capitalize on just kind of anyone who went missed. I don't know if anyone agrees with me on that.
No, I definitely agree, and and I don't know if Alan probably will say the same thing. We tend to, unless we're you're right up against the start of the season or something. If you're a couple weeks out from kickoff, we tend to not, maybe not even draft defenses and kickers, which makes that like looking at the waiver wire even that much more serious because we're just always tinkering. So that I think that's the more active you can be on waiver wire even before the season begins, the more likely it is that you're
Mhm.
going to catch something that others are not.
Totally agree. Um, the next quick topic here was just position runs, right? So you're in the middle of the second round, all the top tier running backs are gone, and now people are starting to go for those, tier one and two wide receivers that are still there. And so I guess the only thing I'll say about this, I'd like to hear your guys' takes, is that that's an opportunity for you to find value, right? So if you notice
Mhm.
that everyone in your draft is like, oh, I have to go for quarterbacks right now because the top three just went. Now I got to get somebody. Well, that's when you can stare down. Oh, wait a minute, but look at this wide receiver right here, who probably should be drafted in this round, but he might not because if everyone's going for quarterbacks, I can strike here. So um, that's an opportunity for me to find some value too, I think.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think your biggest runs come with quarterbacks and then defenses, because you always got that one person who's taking that number one ranked defense off the board, and then we get two, three, four guys that are like, "Hey, let me
Yep.
grab this," and I'm kind of like, "All right, have fun, guys," because having that cheat sheet, having those opinions, knowing kind of who you want, where you want them, don't waver from that. I did that in our mock draft. Like I kind of spazzed out and took Dak. So you know.
Well, that's I mean that's one of the things too is especially with the quarterback run. This is where just going into it, you got to know, like with this year in particular, there's five guys. The top five guys I actually really want. I love the QB depth, but I think that they are better than the rest. And I think that they're really safe picks. If it starts way too early and the run gets crazy, you kind of have to know what's too rich for your blood. If you want to jump in the water because you just don't, you can't walk away without missing out on one missing on one of these guys, then you got to take that pick. But to your point, that's 5 or 6, 7, 8. And some of these I've seen these, all of a sudden everyone's got their quarterback filled out, and you've been picking up other guys that have just been tumbling down the draft board because these picks are coming off too early. So that's a huge moment, and like take a breath when it's happening because we all do it. We're like, okay, here's the run. So take a breath and realize, am I diving into this because I can't miss out on my quarterback or my guy? Or am I going to do the sensible, smart thing and look for value here? Well, we are guilty. I think we're all guilty of doing both things, right? Like
Mhm.
we've all been like, well, crap, I just got to get my guy. Um, but if you take a breath, you can probably come out better for it.
And especially this year with the quarterbacks and wide receivers as deep as they are, this is the one year where you really can't panic at all when there's a run on QBs because you can get
Mhm.
someone, you can get a top tier starter, 3 or 4 rounds later, probably, right? So, yeah. Alan, did you want to add anything before we move on?
And taking a look at last year and kind of the point differentials between position number one and position number 12, especially when you're looking at QBs where there's only a handful of guys, but are you willing to pay that price for X amount of points versus that consistency? So
Yeah, I'm with you. All right. Well, the last thing in our lightning round, and again, this is one where there's a lot of nuance in this conversation, and so I don't necessarily have the answer here. I can tell you what I've experienced, but strength of schedule, and then also the strength of playoff schedules. Um, so it's tough because you could argue this by position. You could say, well, you know, wide receivers versus running backs, there might be less of a discrepancy here versus a tough opponent. Um, so there's a lot of nuance here, but one thing I will say I don't necessarily look at strength of schedule as much overall, because right now I was looking at the strength of schedule and like basically the whole AFC North has a terrible strength of schedule because it's a really strong division and they're playing each other a lot, right? So, but then if you actually drill down into their schedules, it's like, well, it doesn't look like the 25th worst strength of schedule to me. And so I don't look at the overall strength of schedule as much, but I will say that I do look at playoff schedules. And so I forget who the receiver was now, but there was, it was like, I think it was a tweet that was saying, hey, this wide receiver is going against this top tier cornerback and this top tier cornerback in weeks 14 and 15. Um, okay, that means a little more to me because if you
mhm.
know a specific matchup, and this is your guy that you're taking in your second round of the playoffs or whatever, that becomes a tiebreaker for me too. If I'm looking at two receivers that are really in the same tier, but one of them has a really rough go at it, like all 3 games on the road, for example, in the fantasy playoffs. Okay, that actually might be a tiebreaker for me. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that too.
Well, I actually just looked into this the other day, and I feel like a broken record because, like I said, I don't get too hot and too cold about too many things, and so I think tiebreaker is like the perfect way to phrase this. Is
Mhm.
if you're looking, so the Arizona Cardinals probably have the best playoff schedule or one of the best playoff schedules. I can't remember who they're playing, but it's juicy. There'll be points scored. I mean, that whole division is going to score a bunch of points. So you want them to have division games, but I think they also play some cupcakes. And so if you're looking at DeAndre Hopkins versus a couple of guys that are around him, that may be a difference maker for you, right? You're like if he's sitting next to Justin Jefferson or Stephon Diggs, however that starts falling, and you don't know what to do, that's not a bad thing to look at, right? Like you're probably not getting to use that with Kyler Murray unless you're just desperately going to pick either Josh Allen or Kyler Murray. And you happen to like that, but if you kind of have a sense for a few of these before the season starts, it can be helpful, certainly, because we'll talk about it as we get into the season as we're going along. We'll be letting you guys know. Let's keep an eye to these playoff schedules because again, some of this changes, right? Teams that we expect to be good can be bad. Teams that we expect to be bad can be good. So it shifts. So you do have to pay attention to it, but certainly high-scoring offenses, you want your guys playing against those kinds of teams and playing in shootouts during your fantasy playoffs. So it matters, and it's something that you should see.
I agree. I mean, for my
Yeah,
cheat sheets,
I've
it'll be
never
like a
looked.
little star next to their name.
There you go. Yeah, I've never looked very much
Go ahead.
at schedules. So I like that idea of that tiebreaker, and it is so hard to predict. But see, I'm getting all kinds of new stuff. Our draft is going to be fun, you guys.
Oh God, our drafts are gonna suck. I don't even I don't even want to do this
Biases.
now.
I think weren't you talking about Arizona? Because yeah, Kyler Murray's on this list of like, all right, he plays the Lions and the Cowboys in the fantasy playoffs. That's pretty nice, right? So if you have him next to another quarterback, that's where on my sheet I'll put a little star and say, okay, this guy, in this group has the best schedule here. So it's not nothing. I mean, that's for sure.
Well, and think about it for a guy like Chase Edmonds, right? Like if you think that Chase Edmonds is going to be the guy and he's going to keep that job during the year, like you're not slotting him in as an RB1 in your mind, probably. I mean, it's potential, but you might bump him up over Mike Davis or some of those other guys that are there. You're like, wow, this guy's got a real shot to carry me to the promised land in the end if it actually works out. Because you're kind of throwing darts in that that frame anyway. So
Yeah.
I
Meanwhile,
think
Ryan
I
Tannehill. Sorry.
no, you're good.
Meanwhile,
Go.
meanwhile, Ryan Tannehill has the Steelers, the 49ers, and the Dolphins, which I guess would be a revenge game in the fantasy playoffs. So they're saying don't take him either. So it's like some of it you take with a grain of salt, but there is value in understanding the differences there. So
Well, and that's one of the things, one of the reasons why I do like, and we'll talk about this because we're going to have a position by position show to get you ready for the season. One of the things I do like about a top flight, top tier quarterback is that for the most part they are matchup proof. The super
Hmm.
elite, we saw this, we talked about with Josh Allen last year. Everyone said, "Oh, look at that playoff schedule. It's brutal. You don't want him." Didn't matter. He just ran roughshod through the fantasy playoff schedules and kept delivering. Um, there is something to be said for that. A guy like Ryan
Yeah.
Tannehill, who has a great offense and can score a bunch of points, could be totally waylaid by a really tough defense. So
well, and that's
that's it. That is where it gets a little bit tougher, and you probably need that second quarterback on it.
sure, and that's what we were saying about Calvin Ridley last year. That's what we learned about him, right? Is like, is he going to be a stud with Julio Jones out? And he absolutely was. It didn't matter who they played. He was putting up 40 points, So, yeah, understanding who those kind of matchup proof guys are, I think is super valuable.
Well, I think the last thing that we've got for you tonight, we have a listener question. I think this might be our first listener question ever. So very exciting stuff. We touched on it slightly, but Kathy asks, how do you approach drafting a defense? Um, Greg, you want to start?
Sure. I mean, we were talking about this before we hit record on this podcast. We were kind of just talking about defenses for whatever reason. And Shane and Allan were both of the viewpoint that they typically don't draft them. I I tend to draft them not like early, but if I can lock down one of those top tier defenses at a reasonable price, I will get it because if that's just one less thing that I have to stream every week and worry about. So it depends. There's a lot of factors there, and typically I won't get that defense that I want anyways because someone will reach for them. Um, but I will say, and this is one thing we were talking about earlier as well, is like with defenses, I think there's the most discrepancy there versus what actually ends up happening at the end of the season versus what the preseason rankings were. So like I was
Mhm.
just looking at the defensive rankings right now for this season. I mean, the long story short is that like they've got 5 teams here in the top 5, and I bet like maybe 2 of them end up actually being in the top 5. So I think this is one of those things where you should form an opinion on, do some research, and say, you know what, this team, they have a good defense. Why are they ranked 12th on this list or whatever? And have some ones that you actually are okay with, taking a shot on, as opposed to just following the exact ranking list. Because I think there's a ton of uncertainty there.
Yeah, it's definitely for me. It's more of a question of who do you think is better than other people think at defense,
Mhm.
because, like you said, so I think the data doesn't really correlate year to year. Fantasy performance with defenses is not consistent, and so a defense can still be a good defense and not produce significant fantasy
Right.
numbers because turnovers, interceptions, defensive touchdowns, those things don't stay year to year. So when you're looking at drafting, I think having an opinion and for my money, having an opinion on a maybe a second or third tier defense that you think is better than other people think. Think the Jets, right? The Jets defense is going to be strong this year, but I don't think they're going to be drafted well. Maybe something along those lines. I mean, they have a tough schedule, so maybe don't think about the Jets. But anyway, something along those lines
Well,
makes
you
some
raise a good
sense.
point.
But
I mean, you raise a good point about like the flukiness of it. So if a defense has like 3 defensive touchdowns in one week and they put up 35 points, that's going to, like, given how little fantasy points are scored by defenses in the first place, that's going to create a lot of discrepancy as far as like, oh, I see this team scored 120 points last year. They must be really good. You really have to dive into some of that stuff. And so like the list right now for the rankings this year are Rams, Niners, Broncos, Patriots, Chargers. The Does anything stand out there to you guys? I don't know.
I
The
think the Pats
Patriots
are
are like,
probably going to be like right at the top again. They got all their guys back, but they're coming off a bad year, so they're
well, they
depressed,
finished like
right? So
20th last year, right? So,
yeah.
but then beyond that, when you're looking at that next tier, the next 5 or 10 defenses, I don't know. It's really hard to predict.
Wait,
So
where was Washington football team?
Washington is ninth on this list.
Oh, I'm
Jacksonville is
mashing that
before
draft.
them. Right. So after the Chargers, it was Ravens, Bills, Jags, Washington, and then Carolina. Like I would take Pittsburgh before like 3 or 4 of those, even though I hate the Steelers. I think their defense is going to rebound a little bit this year. Um, yeah, I don't know. It's a crapshoot,
Well,
honestly.
yeah, and so we talked about streaming too. It doesn't need to be as
Right.
simple as like each week I stream a defense. What I like to do is I like to pick up a defense, and sometimes this is where I will get a lot of gamesmanship, and I might have two defenses for one week because I know I'm going to drop one. But I want a defense that I can start for the next 3 weeks and be fine with, right? Like I
Right.
don't need to try and get the home run defense for each week because it's really tough to do. That shouldn't be my top waiver claim most weeks. You don't really want to be in that position. But even if you're streaming, you can stream by planning ahead. They've got a nice 3 week schedule that's not bad, and I think I'm going to get 5 to 8 points from this defense for the next 3 weeks. I can live with that, and that's really kind of my approach. Like I don't let them kill me, but I'm also not killing myself.
And you've witnessed me do this, Shane. So I will admit to this publicly. Like I've rostered 3 or 4 at a time. Like because
I've seen it multiple
I
times.
because I get obsessive about this. Because I typically stream defenses too. I typically don't draft like one of those top tier ones, and so I'll stream them, but I'll do the same thing. If I'm looking ahead, I don't. Shane's point about placing a waiver claim on a defense is exactly right. You don't want that to be your first claim because there
Right.
could be a stud player that you're missing out on. And so I'll have like, if especially in like leagues that have way too many roster spots, I'll have like three of them because I'll say, well, okay, for the next 2 weeks, this team has two good matchups, and then they have a bye week. I'm going to drop them, and then I got Cleveland going, 3 weeks against three crappy teams next, and then I'll hold on to this to New England because they're supposed to be good. So like, I'm really weird. I'm that weird guy about rostering multiple defenses. I don't know. It's real stupid, but we all have our quirks.
That's right. Well, we have a buddy that drafted 2 kickers one year, so we all have our
I wouldn't do
differences.
that.
So.
I wouldn't do that.
It's true.
All right, Greg, you wanna if nobody else has anything else, maybe Greg, you can bring us home here.
Well, the only thing that we've already said that I'll just repeat is that it's all about value. Like I can't say that enough. That's what the draft is finding value. And so if you formulate a strategy where you're doing that, where you have certain and forming opinions too, Allan, raised that point early, and it's a really great one. Is that you need to have takes on some of this stuff because you can't just follow the rankings list. You have to do some research on what maybe it's your favorite team, maybe it's your division, maybe it's just teams that you like, whatever. um, Whoever it is, do some research and form some opinions so that you can have a list that says, okay, right around this spot in the draft, I'm going to go for this guy, and maybe I'll even reach for him a little bit because I think he's going to have a great year or whatever it is. So it's all about value, and that's if you can understand that and make your draft strategy, you know, all about finding value, then I think you'll have a successful season.
What real quick, I want to give one anecdote that sort of highlights about how opinions can win out for you. A couple years ago, when Kareem Hunt was coming into the league, there was a lot of buzz in camp, and I don't buy camp buzz. I try to avoid it like the plague. And I was playing with someone I never played before, and she went like 80 spots down the board and grabbed Kareem Hunt, and he ended up being the number one running back in the NFL that year. So not always advisable, but if you take in some news and you feel like this makes a ton of sense and you want to go get them, because quite frankly, if we had felt sort of, I think there's been an overcorrection of this. We did this with CEH last year and Najee Harris this year. Now we're smart, right? We're like, okay, well, we should just draft them where we think we're going to end up. This was a bit of a gamble move, and she jumped ahead of all of us and ended up with an elite player because I wasn't willing to take the risk. So that's a firm example of you having a little bit of information and having a strong opinion on a guy, that you're willing to take a risk on.
This is a fun exercise, Allan. After me, give us your best, you know, um, your best pick along those lines, right? So mine would be 2 seasons ago taking Lamar Jackson because I took him in the 8th round because I really liked him as a player, and I thought
Mm-hmm.
this kid could blow up, and he ended up doing that. And so to get that guy in the 8th round at that time who finishes whatever the top three quarterback that he did or whatever it was, that it feels really good because like it validates like, oh, I did some research, I formed an opinion, and it paid off, and it's a really rewarding feeling to have that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I think my pick would be probably OBJ his rookie year, and unfortunately, it wasn't for my team. It was for my son's team, and I was helping coach him. I'm like, hey, you need a wide receiver. He's gonna have a good year, and he picked him, and he came in second that year.
There you go.
So
I think it's got to be my boy Matt Ryan. I have my eyes on Matt Ryan every year. I'm an apologist. I can't help it. And what was that, 2018, when he was the number 2 quarterback in fantasy
Was that his
football?
MVP season?
And yeah, and he was going 15th plus
Right,
something like
right.
that. He was a second quarterback for a lot of people, and he was my guy late in the draft, and
Yep.
he led me to the promised land.
I like it. It's fun to brag about your fantasy success.
Yep.
Well, if you want me to wrap it up, I can do that. I just want to remind our listeners again to check us out on FFB Podcast at FFB Podcast. Apologies. We need some followers. We're up to 11. That's those are dedicated, loyal listeners. We don't have bots following us or anything like that. So please give us a follow. We try and share some content, news, updates, things that are happening around the league on there. And again, we'd love to get some feedback from you. So feel free to tag us or comment on something that we share just to let us know you're out there. But I think this was a really good show. I think there's a lot of other good shows coming up that Shane mentioned, as far as position breakdowns, sleepers, all these different things, free agency, all these things. So stay tuned. I think we're really getting into gear now, and it's going to be exciting as we move forward.
And come to our Twitter page for our YouTube link because I don't actually know
Right.
how that works. I'm like the worst millennial ever. So we have a YouTube page, and I don't know what the
I didn't
address
know we
is.
had a YouTube page already. I didn't know you created that. But
We
for our
do.
listeners who are checking this out via podcast right now, this is our first one that we've recorded with video, and so we will throw that on our YouTube channel, and I'll put the link to that channel in the Twitter, whatever the header is there, so you can click into that. So we'll take care of that.
Sounds good. We
Right
sound like a
on.
bunch of fuddy duddies. I like it. Well, as always, thank you for joining us. I appreciate you listening and participating with us. And Allan, Greg, you guys are amazing. Thanks for all the wisdom and gems that you've dropped this evening.
Thank you.
And yeah, and we will be back with some more outstanding content for you all in the future.